an uneventful surgery, and we'll certainly pray that that's the case for Jeff. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so Paul yesterday defended himself by saying he has rights, he could use them, he is not being inappropriate in benefiting from, in some regard, from his relationship. Today, he continues that line of response, but he points out that in comparison to what he could ask from the church, he has in fact asked very little. Oh, I'm already, yeah, I knew I would have forgotten something. Welcome,
Hey,
Michael.
everybody. Yeah, the prodigal's here.
All right, well, so jumping in here halfway through verse 12, chapter 9. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple? Those who serve at the altar share in what is sacrificed on the altar. In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing this so that they may be applied in my case. Indeed, I would rather die than that. No one will deprive me of my ground for boasting. If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground for boasting. For an obligation is laid on me, and woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel. For if I do this on my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I'm entrusted with a commission. What then is my reward? Just this, that in my proclamation I may make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. Again, this is an extension of yesterday. This is, Paul had pointed out that he had rights, that he was not outside of bounds in being given certain things by the church. And now he says, I could have asked for more. I could demand more. I could take advantage of this thing that I'm doing as your leader, but I don't, and I haven't. And not only that, but I don't even boast of this thing, because what I do, I do because of Jesus. I don't do it of my own will. I am entrusted with a commission, and my reward is in proclaiming the gospel, making it free to you by not holding my rights over your head.
Yeah, we need to recognize that ultimately, as we come into this, the word that Paul's going to offer is consistent, is that ultimately it's not about boasting. It's actually an obligation to proclaim the gospel. This central idea of call lives throughout this entire book, really. I mean, it goes throughout Paul's entire life. If you read his letters, he is convicted and passionate about a thing that goes beyond just personal preference or his own vocation, his job, the thing that he's supposed to do. Paul is driven forward from that Damascus encounter to do the work of Christ, to be a voice. He is the best example of an evangelist, a person who points to the good news. And, you know, it's interesting when he finds himself in circumstances when he feels like the church is missing it, where they are failing to live up to a thing that they have been called to do, a kind of life and vitality that they should have. And Paul sees that. He's kind of willing to use whatever tool is necessary to help bend that back. And here, I think we started with this idea, hey, yesterday, yes, I deserve to have some sort of partnership based upon I've offered you spiritual things. It's reasonable for me to expect that you would want to support me the other way. And now we begin to see that turn where he's saying, hey, yeah, even though I really have no ground for boasting, I have and continue and seek to be faithful to my call, to what God has called me to do. And I think what you see underneath that is an invitation to the Corinthians to do the same. The question is, what's your call, church in Corinth, and are you living up to that call? And I think that's a really nuanced and really interesting way for Paul to invite that church to live into the same kind of passion that he has.
Keep in mind that Paul is likely writing to a primarily Gentile audience, and yet he refers in verse 13 to those employed in the temple and those who serve at the altar, saying that in both cases they share in what happens there. That those who are employed in the temple, they get food from the food that people bring to the temple. That those at the altar share in what is sacrificed on the altar. And the implication is clear that pastors share in the wealth, share in the produce, share in the benefits of their congregations. And this is not in no way is this true of First Pres, but it's very interesting when pastors are ordained to churches. The pastors take vows, and then questions are asked of the churches. And one of them is, does this congregation vow to pay this minister fairly and provide for them? And so we see here kind of a long-standing struggle in the church where there are moments where churches are reluctant. Churches perhaps say things like, well, they should do this just for the spiritual benefit. And, well, they should do this because they love people. And they should do this because it's their calling. And when the church has tried to take advantage of that logic and not be in partnership with a pastor, or if they've even gone so far as to sort of create a situation in which a pastor or their family could suffer so that the church didn't have to partner with them, then I think these are helpful kind of words. And again, this is not the case here, and we're very fortunate in that reality. But this kind of thing has happened often. And so Paul is pointing out, look, I could ask a great deal of you. I'm the reason you know Jesus Christ. This is my calling. Everyone who does this thing has a partnership that is beneficial to both parties, but I've not done that. I'm intentional in not doing that because the only thing I want to boast about is not what I receive from the church, but what I give to the church. My proclamation that I may make the gospel free of charge. And then in that case, I do not make use of my rights. In other words, I shouldn't have to compel you to do anything because we are mutually engaged in this thing. And so, again, certainly not a comfortable part of the passage, of the chapter, but an interesting one.
Yeah, Clint, that verse 18, what then is my reward? I mean, that's a beautiful question. Actually, a very challenging question, if we're honest, because if we're going to reflect, what is the reward that we seek is fundamentally where Paul's leading us. We each have to account for the goal that we have been chasing, whether intentional or not. And Paul here is saying, my goal is to make the proclamation of the gospel free to all. My goal is to spread the witness as much, as effectively as I possibly can. And, you know, it's in that vein that I don't make full use of the rights that I could make use of, right? Paul's saying, I'm foregoing some things for the sake of another. That is, number one, pointing the church to the thing that matters. To the church in Corinth, it's a reminder, the thing that matters is the proclamation of the gospel. We need to stay focused on that. We as churches do sometimes, well, every church, every Christian is always living in that tension, trying to keep our eyes on Christ and not on the things that surround us, getting out of the boat and sinking, right? And so the idea here is, I think, an affirmation for the Corinthians. Not only is it important that that proclamation happens for free, but how we as Christian leaders, every single one of us, models living our lives in such a way that it's clear that we're willing to give up some things that are due to us. Paul uses the word rights, that we're willing to give up the things that help others to see the thing that is most true, to see the gospel, to see Jesus Christ. That is both encouraging. What I mean by encouraging is inspiring. It might call us forward, but it's also very humbling and challenging for how many times, if we're honest, we find ourselves misplacing those values.
It's outside of the text, but I think the text points us there. You know, I suspect many of you, and I know at First Pres there's in our history, some of these moments, have perhaps experienced a time in which a pastor and church relationship was not good. It was strained, or there was conflict or animosity. And I think what Paul points us towards is this reality that churches and pastors are both best served when there's mutuality, when there's communication, when there's camaraderie and teamwork, and when that relationship is strong. That is clearly good for a church. When a church feels loved and honored and well led by their pastor or pastors, I think that's important. But on the flip side, having lived in that role, it is an undoubted blessing when pastors feel that from congregations as well. And what Paul, I think, is describing by way of its lack is a situation, a scenario in which church and pastor are together in a way that lives past these questions of what do we owe you, or what do you owe me, or what do you benefit from this, or are you getting too much out of us? When those kind of questions are taken off the table because of a good relationship, it is a wonderful moment for a congregation and its leadership to move forward together. And Paul doesn't really get into that, but I think we see it by way of having to kind of examine its opposite here.
Yeah, there is a constructive, you could speak to this more than I could, Clint, but it seems to me that there is a kind of constructive tension, a powerful sort of combination of the congregation and then the leadership of the elders of that congregation, the pastoral leadership. There's this beautiful dance between the calling that we all share and seeking to be faithful in the midst of that call. And, there is a real kind of complicated blessing in that, because congregations by definition are messy. I mean, goodness, we're chapter 9. How many messes have we turned over in the church in Corinth? But every single one of those Corinthians are beloved. Every single one of them are children of God. Paul is seeking to lead them as best as Paul can. And yet there's this push and pull and dynamic tension and even, let's be honest, struggle. I mean, in some cases, very harsh words being offered, trying to all find that unity in Christ. And to whatever extent the Corinthian church never heard or is failing to live up to what they heard, Paul's trying to correct it. And that's tough. That's hard for Paul. That's hard for them. That's hard for us. But we can all relate to that in a really meaningful way. I mean, we've all been on the receiving end of correction, and that's not always negative. Sometimes that's exactly the word that we need to hear, and we try to live forward beyond that. So I think there's an interesting tension here, Clint, and I think that congregations, leaders in all those congregations, we're always sort of trying to find that balance of hearing, listening, but also trying to do better.
Yeah, and again, I think if we have experienced it, we undoubtedly know that it's better when churches and pastors are in good relationship with one another, when those strains are the kind that are helpful and not destructive. And I think Paul doesn't yet have that with the Corinthians. I think that is, this is a damaged relationship, and in the midst of trying to repair it, Paul will have some moments. I think in some ways this next part that we will look at tomorrow, I think there's a sort of pastoral note in it where Paul kind of comes to them. But before he gets there, I think he bows his shoulders a little bit and says, listen, if you wanted to know what it was like for a person to take advantage of you, I could certainly do that, but I've chosen not to. And I think he almost starts with a scolding, which, is maybe not atypical for Paul.
Well, friends, we're glad that you joined us here today. I look forward to continuing on this section. I do think yesterday and today and then tomorrow are very much connected. So if you missed yesterday, maybe jump back to that and listen to that. And I think we're going to really bring all of this will flow into tomorrow. So I hope you join us.
Yeah, I think tomorrow's the strongest part of the chapter. I think a lot of people would feel that way.
Thanks for being with us, friends. Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome! We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So, until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.